very happy to have been asked here, and we'd like to thank the local organisers for their hospitality. I'm going to talk about policy and recommendations, and it's a little bit boring compared to some of the topics that were practical. I mean, you'll go home with some ideas of how better to feed children or how better to work in your clinic, but I'm afraid, unless you work in a government, my talk is not going to be all that riveting for you, but I'll try and keep you awake. Every so often I might check on you just to be sure. So I want to start off with declarations of interest. These are the things which I need to declare. Almost all of them will lead to output, or do lead to output of scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals. And that aside, I then want to move to the main part of my talk, which is about breakfast. And basically, papers have been published looking at the relative importance of breakfast, and it's a cliche almost to say that there are papers out there which constantly tell us that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And that's something that many of us feel, and indeed many of our governments make that point. Now, breakfast aids cognitive function, helps in weight management, is involved in cardioprotective effects, and I'll talk about none of these. I'm going to talk about the latter only, which is optimizing nutrient intake. I'm not going to talk at all about skipping breakfast. That I'll leave to others. And I want to talk about this lady, Audrey Hepburn. She played the role of Holly Golightly, what a lovely name, in a marvelous movie called Breakfast at Tiffany's. And many people think that Breakfast at Tiffany's was a high dining event, that it was beautiful tablecloths and waiters in white jackets and bow ties and so forth. But in fact, she was an escort, as they called them in those days. And when she was finished her evening's work for accompanying gentlemen, she used to go down to Tiffany's to look in the window. Made her happy before she went home. And that was Holly Golightly's breakfast: a coffee in a styrofoam cup, takeaway, and a donut. And I'm asking the question, is that a good breakfast? So the big question I'll be asking all the time is, what makes a good breakfast? Now, when we come to deal with dietary guidelines, there are three possible areas we can look at. We can offer dietary guidelines in the area of nutrients, which we do all of the time. We can offer dietary guidelines in terms of foods, which we do some of the time, and I'll show you examples of both of those. And we can offer it in terms of meals, but we don't do that. And I'll return to that issue at the end of the talk, because if I was asked to say where the future lies, it will be not in foods, but in meals. But that's for another day's argument. So let's look at the issue of foods and nutrients. That's what we're going to be dealing with in this particular paper, asking ourselves the question, how do you define a good breakfast? Do you first set out the foods that you think should be eaten, and then follow that and estimate what the breakfast nutrients should be? Or do you decide somehow that breakfast should contain certain amounts of nutrients, and based on local habits, then start deciding what the best foods would be? And both of those operate at the moment, as I'll show you. This is a slide I want to spend a little bit of time on, because there are three absolutely important issues which have nothing to do with nutrition about what makes a good breakfast. First of all, it has to be affordable. Now, if you look in the United States, which is a wealthy country, 14 million children avail of the school breakfast program. Of those, 12 million receive subsidized breakfast programs in school because they fall below a certain income level. So there's no point in advising a breakfast which costs too much. The second thing is the breakfast has to be easy and convenient, because as has been mentioned many, many times here yesterday, time is a very valuable thing in the family these days. And again, turning to the United States, the NGOs tell me that the main reason why in rural America people skip breakfast at home is they have to take a bus with a long commute to school. So they don't bother having it at home, they take it at school. And the main reason they miss breakfast at school is because the bus is late. So breakfast has got to be convenient, whether it's at home or in the school. It can't require detailed, sophisticated preparation at the point of service. And finally, it has to be appetizing and appealing. And there's no point in us being prescriptive about what we think children should eat, or indeed adults should eat, because we're bound to get it wrong. I'm going to give you an example of one area that went wrong. In 11 schools in Oregon, this is published and referred to in the accompanying paper to this, by the way, they just made their decision in their wisdom to ban chocolate-flavored milk from schools. They thought, well, let's get rid of chocolate-flavored milk and let's have proper old-fashioned milk, which they did, no problem. The difficulty was that the consumption of milk fell by 15%, and the milk wastage went up by 25%. So unless the food is appealing, particularly to children, it won't be eaten. So 3 important things are required for breakfast before you even start talking about nutrients: affordability, convenience, and gastronomic acceptability. Now, I'm going to talk about what governments presently do. I'm going to look at what different approaches there have been or exist at the moment to defining a good breakfast and to issuing guidelines to the general population. And I'm going to take 2 examples that are what I would call superficial and 2 examples that are detailed. And in fact, they're the only 2 countries where I can really find very detailed recommendations on breakfast. So if I start off with the superficial and my own country, it's fairly bland. It simply recommends whole grains, fruit, and I can't read down that far, milk and yogurt and dairy. So it's fairly bland. It's kind of harmless. There's a gut feeling that this might be right, but there's simply no science behind this, none whatsoever. Now, in New Zealand, it's probably fairly similar. They talk about breads and cereals, and in fact, when they list their cereals in the official guidelines, they actually mention a brand, which I think is a bit much for that, but there you go. They go into more detail about jams and butter and what have you. And again, it's what they think should happen. Again, not based on any scientific premise at all. Now, there are 2 examples of the superficial approach. I want to now turn to the more sophisticated approach. And I want to show you that they're fairly weak. And after I've shown you those, I'm going to move to a slightly different approach that the British have taken, and again show you faults in that. So the first one I'm going to turn to is the United States. And there we go, I'm pressing things too fast. This is all listed in an absolute maze of legislation in the United States. I am bewildered by the amount of legislation, and it took me an awful long time to get my head around this, and I'm not sure that I have the right register or the right dates or the right codes or what have you. But basically speaking, as far as I can tell, the Federal Register is setting out for the school breakfast program specifically target nutrients for permitted foods. Now, this is effectively speaking nutrition profiling of foods. It's not a recommendation of what children should eat. It's a recommendation of the nutritional quality of the foods that should be served in the United States. So to me, that's profiling. And if you take a good look at this, you find that it's not really very clever. It's just taking basic adult dietary guidelines and bringing it all the way down to a food and saying every food, or this is an aspiration for all of the foods. So 35% energy from sugar, 10% are from fat, 10% from saturates, and the sodium levels are pretty well similar to the overall recommendations of the United States. So I don't think that's particularly smart, but nonetheless, they do set out that every single food that enters the school breakfast program must meet a particular set of attributes based on that particular table. So that's an approach to making recommendations, not looking at a population of people, but looking at individual foods entering a school breakfast program. The output of that program has not been considered in this context. In other words, they haven't asked, at the end of the day, what would we like the children to have consumed at breakfast? That's not a question they asked. They simply said, what is the input we want into the breakfast system? Now, if I turn to Mexico, and again, my apologies to my learned Mexican colleague, again, whereas the United States is complicated, Mexico is just as bad. So this is the best I can find on the advice of the Mexican government regarding breakfast programs in their schools. But actually what they've done in Mexico is definitely to state what a child should eat. And I've combined the data here from 2 or 3 levels of school ages into one, just for convenience. But they list exactly what the breakfasts should be. The 1,440 kilocalories is what they expect the child to eat in a day, and then they break down the quarter of it of that energy for breakfast. And then if you look down at that, I mean, the Mexicans are no smarter than the Americans. It's basically speaking exactly what the Mexican government issues for adults. It's not imaginative, it's not a complicated issue, it's not based on any detailed analysis. It's simply translating into the Mexican school guidelines what they have for adults. And if we look then at the foods, they, as a result of that, have a list of foods. But as ever in this, there's no connectivity between the nutrient intake and the recommended foods. In other words, I don't know why all of the foods are on that. I don't know what ratios they should be. I don't know what foods are missing from that or why they're missing from that, because these were just plucked from thin air. They were plucked from the wisdom of dietitians and nutritionists that know everything about everything. So I want to move now to the United Kingdom and show you yet another approach here, which I think is probably the least intelligent of all, and I apologize to my British colleagues for saying that, but I just find this amazing. This is commissioned by the Food Standards Agency in the UK. They got the Caroline Walker Trust to come up with an ideal breakfast, and that was very simple. They said, look, you know, 20% of calories come from breakfast, so why doesn't 20% of everything else come from breakfast? That's not a bad idea, but it just doesn't work that way. So I took some data from the Irish survey, and to show you. And basically speaking, with the exception of energy, if you were to put everything at 20%, you would seriously penalize these children. You would bring down their carbohydrates, which are desirable. You'd probably seriously mess up their fiber intake. And when it comes to micronutrients, you would seriously reduce their intake if you were to go for 20% of intakes from breakfast. So the whole idea of constructing advice to people on what is an ideal breakfast is one that I don't think has been done particularly well at the moment by governments. And I have some sympathy with it because it's a complicated process. I do have sympathy. So my preliminary conclusions are that most governments offer what I would call bland advice on food choice. And where they have detailed guidelines, they really are just dietary guidelines. They're just adult guidelines brought down to children. And there's very little in either the United States or in Mexico on micronutrient intake. The focus is on the controversial issues of sodium, fat, and salt. But you'll find very little recommendations about zinc and cobalt, or zinc and copper, or calcium or vitamin, whatever else. And finally, most of the recommendations seem to me to be based on conventional wisdom. And I think that conventional wisdom has a role in science, but it should be maybe the starting point and not the end point. So we return to the question of, so what makes a good breakfast? And I want to move towards an attempt to try and understand the best approach to this. Now, one approach has been to use cluster analysis, and this is something that I've used myself extensively in trying to study the Irish diet. And basically, cluster analysis is a machine learning process. In other words, it's not the researcher that makes the decisions, it's the computer program that makes the decisions. So briefly, it starts off and it picks one subject, and then it searches through the database and it looks for subjects similar to them. You two go together. Then it goes through and it finds a third. You three go together. Until finally they can't find anyone else like this group, and then they start on another group. And ultimately, the machine learning process divides the population into, roughly speaking, as many clusters as makes sense. And of course, it's not just machine learning. The researcher has to have a look and see that there's a reality check on this. But basically, it's mostly machine learning. And the one I want to look at is data from Mexico. And this is a study done by scientists from Nestle, from Cereal Partners Worldwide, and the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And the cluster analysis that was carried out in the US showed in Mexico, showed 6 breakfast clusters. Now, it's very important to say at the outset that the clusters were based on foods chosen at breakfast. So it wasn't all of the foods eaten during the day that entered the system. It was only the foods eaten at breakfast that entered the system. So what we ended up were 6 breakfast clusters. And there they are: milk and sweetened breads, cereal and milk, tortillas and beans, eggs, sandwiches and quesadillas, sweetened beverages. The other thing this data allows us to do is, based on those clusters, to look at the nutrients consumed solely at breakfast, and then the overall daily consumption of nutrients. And I'm going to take a look at that, and probably in the next slide just show you that the clusters make sense. For example, if I look at the bottom line, the sweetened beverages ones is full of sweetened beverages, or the cereal and milk is full of cereals and so forth. So although the cluster analysis gives us a dominant food pattern, almost all clusters contain some elements of every single food, and that would make sense as well. So this table here, I'm not going to dwell on because I'm going to move to a diagram. But the question I want to ask is, if I look at the nutrient intake at breakfast from these 6 clusters, going from the top to the bottom, the highest consumers to the lowest consumers, and I asked myself, if that's the ranking you have for breakfast, what's the ranking like for the same clusters for the day? So this is easier to see in the next 2 slides, at least I hope it is. Take the red bar, that's carbohydrate. And the long red bar is for breakfast only, and the small red bar is for the total day. So what you have is a whopping great variation in carbohydrate intake across these 6 clusters for breakfast. But when you look at exactly the same clusters for the total day, it shrinks dramatically. The same is true of fat, and protein would show, understandably, fairly little change because it tends to be constant. So what I'm saying here is that if you look at clusters at breakfast, you're going to find way out extremes here and way out extremes there. So for example, if you look at the egg cluster, it's going to be very, very different to the tortilla cluster for all sorts of reasons. But the people who had the egg breakfast had something at midday and at lunch, the evening meal and so forth, and it diluted it all down into a more homogeneous pattern. And if you look at the micronutrients, it's even worse. An enormous variation across the clusters of these 3 particular micronutrients, sodium, folate, and calcium, whereas if you look at the total day, the variation isn't so great. And this, to me, is quite important if you want to ask the question, how do we move forward in defining the optimal nutrient intake for breakfast? Do we take the nutrient intakes at breakfast as the starting point, in which case you're going to find huge variation? Or do we say to ourselves, we're going to take the total daily nutrient intake as our starting point? And if somebody gets that right, let's ask, what breakfast do they consume? If somebody gets that wrong, let's ask what breakfast they consume. And maybe it makes no difference, and maybe it makes a huge difference. But the starting point in the approach we're taking is that rather than build breakfast recommendations starting with breakfast, you build breakfast recommendations starting on the total daily nutrient pattern. Now, the conclusions that we have so far is that a good breakfast doesn't necessarily translate into a good daily nutrient intake, and vice versa. A poor breakfast doesn't necessarily translate into a poor breakfast because of the role that other meals play in the process. Now, so we return to the question now of what makes a good breakfast. And we've left behind the bland recommendations of governments. We've taken a look at cluster analysis, and I want to move forward now to describe the area that I'm working on with a number of colleagues internationally in a collaborative project, and show you the direction that we're taking. And we've a long way to go. Basically, this is the International Breakfast Research Initiative. It's funded by serial partners worldwide. It involves Canada, Denmark, France, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In all cases, it involves the National Nutrient Food Consumption Databases and a harmonized analysis of those databases. Now, this is not taking existing data. This is starting from scratch. We all agree what the questions should be, and then we go and address them. Because if you look at the data at the moment, it really is so homogeneous. Each country has looked at it completely differently. Well, we're trying to find a homogeneous approach to it. By the end of September, October, in the journal called Nutrients, we will have a supplement available, and there will be an introductory paper. I've written that and I've submitted it, so that's out for peer review at the moment. There will be 6 country papers, one for each of the countries, that all follow a fairly standard approach in terms of tables and analysis and so forth. There will be a modeling paper carried out by colleagues in France. And then finally we'll come to the big one, which is the policy proposal paper. How do we take all of this data and go forward with a proposal which either will be accepted or thrown out the window? But my work finishes when it's over. I don't care what they do with it after that. Well, I do, but I'm not going to lose too much sleep over it. I return to this issue of trying to define what an optimal nutrient intake at breakfast might be. And again, remind you that there are 2 approaches here. One is to start off with foods and say these are the food patterns that should exist. And then from those devise what the nutrients should be. The second approach is to say, no, these are what the nutrients should be. Now, these are the foods which are going to help you get those nutrients. And we've opted for the former. For the latter. We've gone for defining the nutrients, and the foods will be defined secondary. So the first job will be to define what are the best targets we can come up with for breakfast, for nutrients. And basically, that's based on the premise that the foods are the input and the nutrients are the output, and it's the output of nutrients and its relationship to health that would concern us. So one of the things we've done is to take the nutrient-rich food index, which is being developed by Adam Dranowski, who's one of our partners. And the algorithm I'm showing you here, much edited down, by the way, basically says we'll take all of the positive nutrients and we'll sum them up as a percentage of the reference intake. And if it goes above 100, we'll leave it at 100. And then we'll subtract from that the sum of the negative nutrients, the saturated fat, the added sugars, and the sodium. And this, again, just to remind you, this is for the total daily intake. This is not for breakfast. This is to get a picture of the total daily intake of the nutrients of the subjects in the different countries. And we've divided, each subject therefore receives a score for a nutrient-rich food index. And based on that, we create tertiles, so the top, middle, and bottom. And I'm going to spend a bit of a while on that. And for this example, I'm going to use Irish data. We're not involved in the 6-country study, so I'm not conflicting with the publications here. This is You're walking a thin line here when you're trying to get 2 papers written like this. Now, these are the nutrient intakes at breakfast. If you start off at the very top and look at the NRF score, you'll find that it's much higher in the 3rd tertile compared to the 1st tertile, which is what we constructed. That's exactly what you'd expect to see. Energy intake is fairly similar because we have set it out such that energy is controlled for in this particular exercise. And basically speaking, if you look at the nutrients, you find that things go more or less the way we'd want to go. So the people with the best overall daily nutrient intake have slightly higher protein, which will please one of our speakers today. And these are nutrient intakes at breakfast now, and the fat is lower, the saturates are lower, the total carbohydrate is higher. We don't have value for added sugars on this slide. The reason why total sugars are higher is because of lactose and milk. Starch doesn't change much, and fiber intake goes right up. So what we have are nutrients now that we can begin to work with. And I think if we go to the next slide, we find on the micronutrients, we find, again, a huge increase in overall intake of micronutrients at breakfast among the individuals whose index for the day is better than those for whom the index for the day is not so good. So we can take the nutrient intake in tertile 3 and somehow work on that to come up with recommendations for standards for breakfast. And that's what we're going to do. If the WHO has a standard and we think it's reasonable, we're not going to touch it. But the WHO does not have a standard for breakfast for anything. But if we can avoid conflicting with big agencies like the WHO, we will certainly do so. But for example, nobody can tell me on the planet what the ideal intake of iodine intake should be for breakfast. But we're going to try and give you a figure for that. Okay. Now I want to turn and talk about foods, because this is how we're going to define nutrients, and we've got a lot of work to complete this yet. And so you just have to wait till October or November to read the papers, I'm afraid. I want to talk about foods because that's something which this conference has paid a lot of attention to, and certainly on the first day. People talked about, what foods should be eaten, ideally speaking, for breakfast. And we want to make the point here that there are three ways to look at food intake. What we are looking at here is the average intake for the total population. So you'll see that all the foods that you'd imagine are desirable are up in the 3rd tertile. So people who have a good daily diet, their breakfast contains more wholemeal bread, more ready-to-eat breakfast cereals like porridge, low-fat milk, yogurts are up, and bananas, fruit juices, and so forth. So we have a good profile of foods here. And so what you'd be inclined to say to yourself is, well, if that's the case, we'll just make a recommendation that we should increase the intake of these foods and everything will be better. Now, the problem we have here is that this is the population intake. Not everybody eats all of these foods. So these mean values contain zeros. What would happen if you take the zeros out? Now, here we're looking at consumers only. And again, what you're seeing here is that among consumers, everything is up, but it is really marginal compared to when you look back at the previous one, where you find huge differences. So low-fat milk, 20 to 70, whereas low-fat milk is 80 and 100. So basically speaking, people who consume foods tend to consume them at more or less the same servings. We've worked this out as servings per week, and that appears in the paper that will be accompanying this particular workshop, but I haven't bothered with it on this particular slide. So food intakes at breakfast among consumers remains the same. I think I did miss a slide here. I apologize. This one is percent consumers, sorry. So as you see, as the as you go to a better type of diet, you find the average intake is higher, but the percentage of people consuming these foods is higher. The average intake among the consumers is not higher. So the secret is not to get the people who eat the food to eat more. It's to get the people who don't eat the food to start eating the food. The message is completely different. And that's the big mistake we're tending to make when we talk about developing food-based dietary guidelines. Getting somebody to eat a cereal who doesn't eat a cereal is a far bigger challenge than getting somebody who eats a cereal to eat it 7 days instead of 6 days. So the big challenge is in changing food patterns by getting people to do things they never did before. And that's, so just to point out in a kind of a summary way, the differential between the first and third tertile for the population is a factor of 2. It's 60% higher among consumers, percentage consumers, but when you take consumers only, every consumer is more or less eating the same as every other consumer. A pot of yogurt is a pot of yogurt, a bowl of cereal is a bowl of cereal. If you want to change breakfast, it's percentage consumers you want to change. So I'm going to come to the end of the talk shortly, and just to come up with a few general conclusions. Most governments offered, as I say, bland advice. Of those that give detailed quantitative advice, most of them are based on adult data. There's little science behind the food targets. In fact, there's no science behind the food targets at all. And there's very little advice on micronutrients. The focus seems to be on sugar, fat, and salt. Cluster analysis is very useful. It has its advantages, but it also has its disadvantages. The nutrient-rich food index, I'm quite adamant in saying it offers some as yet untested routes. We're going to test it and see if it works. It may not be the best way forward, but at least we're going to find out. And then I'm going to end up with my last statement and then my last slide. The future is meal-based and digital. We're talking here about food consumption patterns, looking at how many bananas a person might eat, or for breakfast, or what have you. And out there in the big wide world are kids and youngsters that are connected to the digital age in a way that most of you are not. So the future will be digital, that's for sure. Now, if the future is digital, and I want things to be sensible, I don't want to know I should eat less cheese, more yogurt, less potatoes, more apples, less eggs. What the hell use is that to me? I want to know, what should I have for breakfast? What should I have for lunch? What should I have for an evening meal? How can I work out a nice monthly menu that I like, that's healthy and nutritious and fits into my idea of food preferences? And that's the way forward. Now, people say this isn't going to happen. We've done a lot of work in the European Union on personalized nutrition, I think far more than has been done in other countries, particularly in the United States. We've invested a huge amount of money, and there's at least 4 or 5 competing consortia going to be funded this year on what they call smart nutrition by the European Union. So it's going to be really a big area of development. It'll involve all sorts of things, from apps to computers to what have you. You see, what you want to do is to empower the consumer. And that means that you talk about inputting data about habitual food intake, not to a dietitian in front of you, but to some sort of electronic device, a telephone or an iPad or a computer. And out there in cyberspace, in some respectable server that provides personalized dietary analysis, you'll get your dietary analysis, and then you'll be sent back your output. And your output will tell you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. Now, you are now empowered in a way you were not empowered before, because in the past, you were going into the supermarket like everyone else with a pyramid in front of you, or a plate, or if you're in China, a wall, whatever else, silly, daft things that they use. But now you'll know exactly, my big problem will be folic acid, fiber, and vitamin C. Her big problem is something else. So let her solve her problem, I'll solve my problem. I now want to know what foods I need to buy, but I want to know how to buy those foods in the context of the meals I kind of want to have. I don't want to be told more cheese. What do I do with the cheese? So these are real facts of life here. Smart shopping is a reality, and I scan everything when I go shopping. It's everyone, I think a lot of people do it. Just scan, 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 scan. Go to the checkout and it's scanned and the price comes up and so forth. In the future, that will go directly to my computer or to the cloud with my ID on it. And I'll go home and I'll have a smart fridge. This is a Samsung smart fridge. The fridge will have received the data. So it will know what I purchased. It will have received data from the analysis, so it knows what my targets are. Now, I might want to make a meal, and I know from, or the computer will know, the fridge's computer will know what's available in the house. And if I decide I want to have a meal, it'll tell me the options based on the foods available. And if I say, well, I've never cooked that before, it'll say, well, here's the recipe. And I say, that's a bit complicated. It'll say, search YouTube on your fridge door, and we'll give you 6 YouTube videos on how to cook it. Now, you might laugh and say, that's not going to happen. It's happening. Samsung and Philips are both doing this. So it's not as though I'm making it up. It's happening. Smart dining hasn't come around yet, but there are a number of examples, and probably one of the best one is in Wageningen in the Netherlands, where they have a shop which they used for many, many years in their studies on dietary intervention, and now they're trying to use that shop as a smart shop, smart dining. And then, of course, smart delivery. Amazon will deliver it, and soon it'll deliver it by drone, so all your goods will be left on your front doorstep, and the bag from yesterday will be taken away, and when your larder gets a little bit empty, it'll tell you that you're low on tomato ketchup or whatever it might be. So that's the future, and when we're thinking about planning ahead for making recommendations on breakfast, we can either hold on to the present and do it that way, or we can hold on to the present but have an eye on the future and say to ourselves, actually, that's the way young people want this, and deliver it in that way. One of the absolutely essential requirements, if we're going to deliver personalized nutrition and smart nutrition, is to move away from giving advice on foods to giving advice on meals. It doesn't say we don't give advice on foods, but the next step up will be to give advice on meals. Now, we've been looking at a number of ways of trying to develop different approaches to this. We've used data mining techniques, and then we've used pragmatic generic coding systems. And they may not be perfect, but we're getting there. And it's a major element of the research of my colleagues in UCD. And of course, the author on the last one there is my daughter, believe it or not. So it's keeping it in the family. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gibney, for that wonderful presentation, for giving us your insights regarding what should be a good breakfast database, and what are the possible best approaches in the future so that we can address that phenomenon. I don't want to take up much of the time because we have 20 minutes and 41 seconds to be exact for your questions, comments, and insights regarding the presentation of Professor Gibney. Okay. First, Dr. Salvador, and then our friend from Indonesia.
Thank you for addressing Mexican breakfast, because it's a huge problem. And I think it has to do also with our obesity problem with kids. And my question is related especially for, do you really think that governments should have a recommendation on breakfast whatsoever. Because let me tell you the story. In Mexico, there is this recommendation. There's desayunos escolares to prevent malnutrition. I mean, undernutrition. That's the whole idea. But the thing is that kids will come to school with a glass of milk and a bread and cookies or so, and then they will have breakfast, and then they will have lunch, and they will come back home and they will have another lunch. You see, so there's a huge amount of calories coming into these government planned, smartly planned breakfast that shouldn't be there, in my very humble opinion. But I sincerely think that governments shouldn't be, you know, like deciding what we should be eating or the kids should be eating. This is a very ancient approach, and I mean, in the sense that you talked about now, it cannot happen like that. It should happen like very personalized, and as you said, like very in the digital concept of smartness, you see. So do you really think that we should still have governments taking decisions of this sort?
Far be it from me to tell governments what to do, but there are people who can't afford breakfast, and you've got a choice. Do you say, okay, well, suffer on, and good luck to you? Or do you say, well, no, the state will actually provide a breakfast for you? So that's not a scientific decision. That's a risk management decision. It's nothing to do with me. I can only say what the problem is. It's up to them to decide on exactly what the solutions would be. To take up your point about, say, the issue of malnutrition and obesity, I think that one has to be very intelligent and flexible about this. There's no point in coming up and saying, you know, we have a set of dietary guidelines and that's it. What you have to say is, this looks like it will work for most people. And then there's going to be exceptions. And there will be exceptions according to country, there'll be exceptions according to whatever else, be it allergies and so forth. But I do think that there's an expectation that we need to have a standard for breakfast for nutrients. And this is because it's possible for breakfast. Breakfast is consumed with a constancy that no other meal is consumed. We reckon that 65 to 70% of people over a 4-day period will eat more or less the same breakfast every day. And if we take minor changes out, that will rise up to nearly 90%. So we're capable of offering advice. Do we need it? I think we do. I think people want to know if we're advising about breakfast. I mean, you've seen what the New Zealanders do, the Irish do, the Mexicans, the Americans do. It's all over the place. So I think there's a need for it.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very inspiring information from you, Michael. The first question is, any evidence that any particular vitamin or mineral we need more in the morning compared to the lunchtime or dinner time? Is the first question. And the second question, after deriving the food, the breakfast pattern based on the principal component analysis, and then you analyze the third tertile of the nutrient, what kind of tool later on to formulate a good variety or a good quality breakfast, using linear programming or any other tools? Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, I can't answer your first question, but it's a very good one. Are there micronutrients in particular that would be better off to be consumed at breakfast, more in breakfast, based on some biological principle? No, I don't know. I think we're going to hear a talk on protein. As to, the argument could be made that there are certain advantages in having more protein. Probably carbohydrate is another. From the point of view of cognitive function, but I don't know enough about that area. But from the point of view of micronutrients, there may well be, but no one has the biology to explain that. The second question was about shaping food patterns. I'm after forgetting it a little bit. Can you just remind me? Sorry. I'll think of it in a minute, but
For that, there are two ways to
Yeah.
get the call that quality or good breakfast. First, apply the principal component analysis to
Yeah, okay, yeah.
understand about the
linear modeling you mentioned.
type. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the second one, you try to find the tertile of the nutrient, the tertile of the nutrient index of the subject.
During the day, yeah.
Yeah, during the day. It's not during the breakfast.
No, the day.
So my question is, any appropriate tool or special tool to formulate the quality breakfast based on that two approach?
Yeah, well, some people from France are in our group working on linear modeling, and they're not only looking at the foods that would be best consumed to meet particular nutrient patterns, and they'll be looking not just at one nutrient pattern, but at several nutrient patterns. They're also looking at how those foods have a carbon footprint, so to speak, or the whole area of its environmental impact as well. But yes, linear modeling will play a role in deciding what are the best food consumption patterns to meet particular breakfast nutrient intakes.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael, for that very good presentation. How I wish we also have seen in your illustration the Filipino breakfast. But I'd just like to ask, our government has actually a national program on supplementary feeding among our school kids. And it's actually a lunch, one lunch per day for 120 days. And that is catering to our severely wasted and wasted children, if there are funds. Now, in an environment where finances is really very meager, is it more nutritionally beneficial to give breakfast rather than lunch?
I don't know. There will be two speakers telling you how important breakfast is and that you've got to get that right. So I'll let them argue that case. I suppose at the end of the day, from a personal point of view, if lunch helped people get the correct nutrients and that was working, I'd be happy with that. But there will be a lot of people who say it should be front-loaded to make sure that breakfast was correct. And there's a lot of sense in that. I mean, if the children are having a hearty lunch but not having a good breakfast, I'm not too sure that's a good idea, particularly for young growing children. But there's the evidence on the impact of breakfast on outcomes like cardiovascular disease, cognitive function. You could argue all day about it, at least I could.
Thanks, Mike, for a great talk. I'm interested, you mentioned that hopefully one of the outcomes of these various projects that are going on at the moment is to make recommendations in terms of micronutrient intake as well. And my question is, how will you derive the level of micronutrient intake that's optimal, particularly in children, because at the moment we don't have sufficient biomarkers, we don't have the data that actually tells us this is the sufficient amount. We're extrapolating from an adult population. So are you proposing a new approach to that, or how are you going to tackle this issue?
Well, I certainly agree with you that there's no biological data on almost any micronutrient in relation to children at different age groups. That's almost for certain. Maybe iron is an exception. What we'll be looking at is, if you take a given country like Denmark and you say to yourself, what Danish kids get their overall diet best in the day? Now, what breakfast do they consume? With that breakfast, what is their pattern of micronutrient intake? And would it be advisable to try and get more Danish kids to achieve that? And that's the approach we're taking. So the approach we're taking is based on patterns of reported food and nutrient intake rather than on the biology, because there's no biology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just So will you be looking then at the children, you say this is the kind of gold standard of nutrient intake across the day based on these children thriving particularly well or developing particularly well?
No, we'll be using the nutrient-rich index, which is a measure of the overall balance of nutrients in the diet, and dividing them into, the total day, those that get it extremely right and those that get it quite wrong. So it's based on the total daily nutrient intakes. And then we'll look at their breakfast and see how they're doing, compare it to their breakfast, and see if we can come up and say, this seems a reasonable figure. For example, here's a question. How much fiber should a kid eat at breakfast? I mean, that's not an unreasonable question to ask. Should it be no fiber? Should it be 5 grams of fiber, 4 grams, 3 grams? So that's the sort of question we're trying to answer. Now, in some parts of the world, you're going to find that, say, for example, just take the fiber intake. Denmark has a very high fiber intake among school kids. I mean, whole grain meals are very popular. Spain, breakfast in Spain is very different from breakfast in Denmark. So their fibers will be extremely low. Now, we're not going to force Danish values on Spanish kids. All we're going to say is there are basic principles you can apply if you want to devise recommendations for your country. So that's really what we're doing. We're not going to come up with a universal figure that will apply everywhere.
Okay, just a short question here before I give the privilege to our chair to wrap up for the last question. This is something from the floor. This pertains to your statement regarding give advice on meals, not foods. Will it be applicable in developing countries? And a corollary to that is it about building a healthy plate for breakfasts?
Well, I'm not too sure that the two are connected. I think there are certain parts of the world where it's going to be hard to work on meal-based, and I think Asia is probably an example. If I sat down at lunch yesterday, and if I looked at the table that went around, and I asked about meals, you know, it's quite different in some parts of the world, so it'll be a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. It'll be a bigger challenge, but not impossible. As regards breakfast, yes, meal pattern analysis and personalized meal advice can easily operate at breakfast. In other words, I know what breakfast I like, and I know that's what I want for 5 days a week, and on the weekends I want it slightly differently. So I can build that into personalized dietary advice for breakfast, yeah.
So for the last 7 minutes, Professor, can we allow her for the last verse before Dr. Nicholas?
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael. My question is this. There's a growing number of problems with regards to children's going to school, either in rural or urban areas, because probably of so many factors like traffic or the early start of the schooling. And most of these children doesn't have the appetite to eat. Would high-calorie milk with fiber would be sufficient for these children as a source of their breakfast? And if it is expensive for families who are poor to get these sources of a kind of milk, are there possibility for our lawmakers to supplement the expenses for this kind of project?
Well, I think, you know, in all honesty, we're a long way from answering the first part of the question, and it would depend on the cultural setting. I mean, in the Philippines here, yesterday we heard milk is not just an important part of the diet. I think I'm correct in saying that. And so I'm not too sure how successful you'd be to solve breakfast issues with milk here. You'd more or less have to look at what are the foods that Filipino children eat among those whose diet is overall good, and ask how can we foster that type of meal eating. In other words, you need to look at the real world rather than what you think is ideal. So if you look at patterns of food intake in Filipino children, you should be able to identify those that have very good diets and then look at their breakfasts. Those that have poorer diets, look at their breakfasts. And on that basis, start making recommendations about how food patterns might change. As regards what governments should do, again, you know, that's a risk management decision. It's a political decision. It's not mine. I think our job is to do the science and say what the problems are and potential solutions, and it's up to governments to decide whether or not they want to do this. In many countries, they will do it. They'll try and help children who are socially disadvantaged.
I'd like to just end the questions, and I apologize if I didn't hear you correctly, Mike and Sandra, but it appears to me that there's a research gap, and I'd like to emphasize that research gap. So you use the nutrient fiber. I'm going to use potassium as an example. So we know that potassium intake is extremely low in the American diet overall. So the research gap is, how do we translate potassium content for a breakfast meal? Looking at the contribution of the total diet to potassium and then going backwards as that approach to identify some kind of criteria. What criteria would we use that would be reasonable in terms of your three things you showed on your slide, in terms of being easy, convenient, cost-effective, and palatable at the same time?
Yeah, I think that one of the things we're moving toward in the International Breakfast Research Initiative is to prioritize nutrients. And I think that something like potassium might not get as high a priority as folic acid and calcium and other issues. The data on some of these nutrients is not so great. And but basically, the principles that we're outlining should apply to any nutrient. If you can divide your population up into those whose daily diet is excellent and those not so excellent, and then you ask what are the breakfast patterns of food and nutrient intake, you should be able to see how you move from one to the other. And that might apply also with potassium. You start looking at what are the sources of potassium in one group as opposed to the sources of potassium in another group? What are the intakes of potassium in one group as opposed to the intakes in another? And see what's feasible and practical. The solutions, at the end of the day, are local, but the principles are what we're trying to establish, not sort of come up with a solution to solve the global problem.
Okay, please. 2 minutes.
I won't take 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Professor Gibney, for your talk. I just wanted to ask a comment and a question. The comment is from a sensory point of view. Breakfast is a mystery, that people will eat the same foods every single day for breakfast. We can't understand that because, of course, you won't eat the same dinner 2 days in a row, you won't eat the same lunch even 2 days in a row. And then the comment, that's the comment. The question is primarily then around this new emerging area of the chronobiology of timing of calorie consumption, and the idea that you should feast before 4 and get all your calories for the day in before certain times to minimize the metabolic impact of food intake, for example. Are you accounting for anything to do with the timing of calorie intake within the day in your modeling of breakfast recommendations?
Well, the answer to the second one is not at all. Chronobiology, I don't think I heard the word mentioned in the course of our work. No, we haven't at all. Going back to your comment, you're correct. It's extraordinary that people eat the same breakfast every single day. And you couldn't do that for lunch or evening meal. But it kind of tells you something about breakfast. It's a comfort. It's like a teddy bear. You know, so I get up in the morning, I want to be loved. You know, give me my favorite breakfast and then I'll face the day somehow on the basis of that. So I've got 41 seconds left if you want.
Anybody who can ask a question for the last 34 seconds? Okay, I think we need to thank Dr. Gibney at this point in time. Thank you very much for your presentation.